Poor maid is humiliated in front of her family until the millionaire says, "She's the real boss here." The hall was packed, the lights reflected off the crystal chandeliers, and every glance seemed to weigh heavily on her. The young maid, in a simple uniform and worn apron, was balancing a tray of glasses when she tripped on the red carpet and spilled wine on the millionaire's daughter's evening gown. Laughter cut the air like knives. Malicious comments echoed. "She's not even good enough to serve. She must have come straight from the favela to tarnish the party." Her face burned, not only from the mistake, but from the collective contempt. The guests backed away, as if her presence were a social stain. She tried to wipe away the spill with trembling hands, but every gesture seemed to worsen the scene. The silence in the hall was shattered by even louder laughter, and shame burned like fire in her teary eyes. In that moment, everyone treated her as if she were invisible, or worse, unworthy of existing in that place. It was then, amid the laughter, that a firm voice echoed above all the others. The millionaire, until then silent, raised his hand for silence. The entire room shuddered as he approached her, still kneeling, trying to clean the floor. His piercing eyes swept over each guest, until finally, in a tone that chilled the air, he said, "You don't understand a thing. She's not a simple maid. She's the real owner here." The silence turned to shock. Glasses froze in mid-air, gazes met in astonishment, and the laughter abruptly died. No one knew for sure if it was a metaphor, a revelation, or a direct affront to collective arrogance. But everyone understood in that instant that the logic of the party had been turned upside down. This woman, humiliated in front of everyone, carried a secret that would forever change the invisible hierarchy that sustained that world. If this scene has already made you feel the shame, injustice, and unexpected twists that life can bring, don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow each new story that touches your heart and exposes the power of destiny. Leave a like to further strengthen this space where we reveal that no one stays on the ground forever. And write in the comments, do you believe that justice comes at the right time even when everyone seems against you? Your answer may inspire others who are also living their own silent battles. The mansion stood in the heart of New York like a monument to excess. The white marble reflected the lights from the entrance, and the main hall looked like something out of a movie, with chandeliers that shone like suspended suns and long corridors lost in gilded mirrors. Inside, the elite gathered in luxurious gowns and tailored suits, every detail calculated to impress. The atmosphere exuded power and indifference, as if everyone there believed the world revolved around their conversations and laughter. It was the tycoon's daughter's birthday, a celebration that felt more like a parade of vanity than a family party. Guests discreetly competed for glances, business deals, alliances, and opportunities, while waiters moved like swift shadows, trying to meet the demands of every glass, every dish, every whim. Among them, almost invisible, was the young waitress. She carried a tray with measured steps, her eyes lowered, and a posture that blended discipline and weariness. Her simple uniform contrasted with the surrounding brightness, like an uncomfortable reminder that this spectacle required anonymous hands to exist. She walked between tables, surrounded by frivolous conversations that barely acknowledged her presence, except when something didn't go exactly as expected. Yet there was something different about her, a restrained but steady gaze that, on rare occasions, lifted to observe the world as if memorizing every gesture, every word, every face, not out of curiosity, but for a greater, silent reason. From across the room, the millionaire watched. Imposing in his impeccable black suit, he spoke little, but his presence was enough to command the room. He was known for his bold business dealings and a fortune that seemed to grow with each passing year, but also for a calculating coldness that drove away true friendships and attracted only self-serving alliances. His children and friends surrounded him like satellites, and his every word was received as a sentence. Still, his eyes occasionally strayed to the discreet figure of the young woman circulating among the guests. There was something about her that seemed to awaken old, almost forgotten memories, but which insisted on returning with an uncomfortable force. The mood at the party oscillated between glamour and quiet tension. Each guest strove to show more of what they had, more of what they were worth, and the atmosphere was weighted down by fragile appearances sustained by practiced smiles. Classical music filled the air, but beneath the soft melody, one could sense the coldness of relationships based on convenience. The maid, invisible to almost everyone, was the only one in the room who seemed not to belong. And yet, for some mysterious reason, her presence was indispensable for the evening to reach a climax no one expected. Her past wasn't written in diaries or smiling, framed photographs. It was etched in invisible scars, in the corners of eyes that learned too early to weep silently, and in hands that bore calluses even before youth blossomed. She came from a forgotten suburban neighborhood, where the streets were crisscrossed by crumbling wooden houses, and the sound of sirens was more common than the sound of children's laughter. She grew up amid neglect, with her mother struggling to feed 2 children with temporary jobs that barely paid the rent, and a father who disappeared when she was still learning to say her own name. Her childhood was marked by absence, and each birthday was remembered. More for the loss than the celebration. At 10, she already knew the hardship of waking up early to help out in neighboring houses, cleaning grease-stained floors, washing clothes that weren't hers, listening to harsh orders and rare thanks. The world seemed to constantly remind her that she didn't belong, that her existence was only tolerated as long as it served the purposes of others. The dreams she once cherished, like studying, dancing, or simply being a child, were crushed by the weight of necessity. As a teenager, while other girls were trying on dresses for the school prom, she was trying on mops and floor cloths, immersed in seemingly endless work days. The abandonment wasn't just financial, but also emotional. She felt invisible, as if no one noticed the silent strength she carried within her small body. There were no gifts, but there were debts. There were no words of encouragement, only weary glances from her mother and the constant emptiness left by her father. Loneliness was her faithful companion, and each night she fell asleep with the feeling that the whole world conspired to keep her in the same place, with no way out, no choice. Yet amidst the pain, something was born that no one could erase, an almost supernatural resilience. She learned to endure insults without crying, to smile when her heart burned, to rise from the ground when everyone expected her to remain fallen. She kept an invisible secret within herself. She didn't just want to survive. She wanted to prove to the world that her pain would not be in vain. She didn't need to say anything, but her soul already screamed silently that one day, somehow, there would be justice. Her past didn't give her luxury, but it did give her something no amount of money could buy: the ability to look arrogance in the eye and not bow down, even when she seemed the most fragile of them all. The maid's uniform was just a facade for someone who had weathered deserts of abandonment and storms of humiliation. It was this invisible strength that sustained her now, in the midst of the luxurious party, surrounded by people who could never imagine where she came from or how much she had to bleed to stand. In that luxurious ballroom, where every gesture seemed rehearsed and every look carried silent judgment, her fate was sealed by a cruel game. The millionaire's daughter, draped in her shimmering gown that seemed to scream superiority, had been instigated by a group of equally arrogant friends. Amidst glasses of champagne and venomous smiles, a bet arose to prove that the maid was incapable of even the simplest tasks. One of the young men laughed out loud, commenting that the girl in uniform could never survive a night without making a mistake, and another added, challenging the heiress to expose this in front of everyone. The perverse game quickly turned into a spectacle. The daughter then called the maid across the room, interrupting the music and attracting the guests' attention. With a false smile, she asked her to bring a tray with the most expensive glasses, the imported crystal ones treated like heirlooms. The request was fraught with malice, as everyone knew the risk. Any slip-up would be cause for irreparable shame. The group laughed, encouraging the act, and even some adults who should have been reprimanding chose to watch in silence, complicit in the mockery. The young woman, accustomed to obeying, didn't hesitate to accept, even with sweaty hands from nervousness. She walked slowly between the tables, balancing the tray with extreme care, each step as if crossing a minefield. But that was exactly what they wanted, to make her a target of mockery. One of the young men surreptitiously extended his foot under the red carpet. She stumbled. The sound of breaking glasses echoed through the room like thunder. The shattered crystal reflected the golden lights, scattering shards across the floor and into her heart. Wine-stained expensive dresses and leather shoes, and the scene quickly became a spectacle of contempt. Laughter filled the air, some muffled, some open, but all equally cruel. The millionaire's daughter, triumphant, lifted her chin and said loudly, "I told you she was worthless. In here, she's only good for cleaning the floor we walk on." The weight of those words fell upon the young woman like a blow. The silence that followed the laughter was even more devastating, because there was no compassion in the eyes, only the delight of seeing her reduced to dust before everyone. Shame burned, and the feeling of helplessness was suffocating. Yet behind the pain, there was a hidden glimmer, a hidden secret, something no one could yet perceive, and that would soon make every laugh turn to silence. The hall was still echoing with laughter when he stood up. The millionaire didn't usually intervene in trivial situations, but there was something about that scene that bothered him in a different way. While everyone jeered, he walked slowly toward the fallen maid, and the silence began to spread like an icy wave. The sound of his footsteps on the marble floor echoed louder than any music. The young woman, kneeling, was still trying to collect the shards, her fingers trembling, her eyes tearing. It was then that she looked up for the first time, and their eyes met. He stopped, staring, as if struck by a dormant memory. For an instant, it wasn't the maid he saw, but something deeper, as if he'd known that expression of pain for a long time. She, in turn, didn't back down. The fear anyone else would have felt dissolved into an unexpected firmness. Her gaze held his, without submission, without servitude. It was as if she were silently saying, "I've experienced worse humiliations than this, and you can't break me." The millionaire felt his heart race, a rare discomfort for someone accustomed to controlling everything and everyone. Behind his cold demeanor, something inside him wavered. The entire room watched, unable to comprehend the tension that hung between the two. The contrast was stark, the most powerful man in the room staring at the invisible young woman as if she were suddenly the only presence that mattered. The guests whispered, but no one dared interrupt. The air felt heavy as if time had slowed down. Finally he spoke. His voice was deep, controlled, but carried a different, almost intimate tone. "Stand up." It wasn't a dry order, but it wasn't a request either. It was something in between, a summons. She hesitated for a second, then slowly rose, keeping her eyes fixed on him. The fallen tray, the scattered shards, everything seemed to pale in comparison to that silent exchange. As he stood, the millionaire leaned in slightly to whisper, but everyone still heard, "Don't apologize to them, you don't owe anyone here anything." The shock was immediate. The guests exchanged confused looks. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was just a tease. Others fell silent, realizing there was more to the statement. The daughter, furious, clenched her fists, feeling her game had been stolen. But the young woman didn't answer. She just took a deep breath, as if harboring a secret too heavy to reveal there and then. The look she gave the millionaire, however, carried something no one understood. It was as if to say, "I know who you are, and you know who I am." At that moment, the party continued, but nothing would ever be the same again. The laughter didn't cease with the trays fall. On the contrary, it became a collective spectacle, a ritual of contempt that transformed one person's pain into entertainment for dozens. The millionaire's daughter, her dress still stained with spilled wine, seized the opportunity to display her cruelty. She stood up theatrically like an actress on stage and pointed at the maid, raising her voice for all to hear. "Here's proof that some people were born only to carry the burden of others. She will never be more than that. She's just a shadow that cleans what we've soiled." The room responded with nervous laughter, some uncomfortable, some open, but all complicit. The glow of the chandeliers reflected in eyes that looked at her as if she were a stain, something that needed to be erased from the luxurious scene. The young woman remained motionless for a moment, trying to catch her breath, Her knees ached, her hands were cut by the shards of glass, but what burned most was the complicit silence. No one came to help her. No one dared defend her. It was as if her humanity had been stripped away in front of everyone. One of the young men, encouraged by his daughter, threw a dirty napkin on the floor near her, saying mockingly, "Since you're there, clean this up too. That's all you're good for, isn't it?" The gesture was accompanied by ironic applause, as if the party had gained a new spectacle. The maid, however, didn't bow. She slowly collected the shards, her eyes watery but fixed, never lowering her head more than necessary. It was as if each movement were a silent resistance. Still the insults continued. The daughter, feeling in control, crossed her arms and snapped. "My father can pay for her mistake with a snap of his fingers. But the shame is hers. This is where people like you belong, kneeling invisible, dirtying the carpet you'll never be able to buy." The millionaire remained silent, observing the scene with an enigmatic gaze. The tension between him and the maid still vibrated in the air. But no one noticed. Everyone was focused on the cruel theater unfolding. The humiliation had been public, but behind the young woman's wounded face lay a flame that had not yet been revealed. And it would be this flame that would transform every laugh into silence at the right moment. The following hours of the party dragged on as if the air were charged with electricity. The music continued. Conversations attempted to return to a normal flow, but something had already shifted in the atmosphere. The maid remained silent, still picking up invisible shards of dignity that the collective mockery had tried to destroy. But inside, her every gesture was no longer one of submission, but of preparation. She had waited for this moment longer than anyone there could have imagined. While the guests were distracted, she walked toward the central table, where the dessert plates were decorated like works of art. No one understood when she calmly set down the tray and, instead of turning away, looked up. Her eyes swept the room steadily, and all the whispers fell silent, as if an invisible force had drawn their attention to that previously invisible figure. The millionaire's daughter, still drunk on cruel triumph, couldn't resist provoking. "Have you lost your tongue? Are you going to apologize on your knees or wait to be fired?" It was at that moment that the young woman responded, for the first time. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that forced everyone to listen. "I haven't missed anything," she said calmly. "On the contrary, I always knew exactly what would happen here today." The room shook at her statement. The guests laughed nervously, thinking it was just insolence. But she continued, each word cutting through the air. "You think you know me. You think I'm just someone who cleans your glasses and picks up your scraps. But I see more than you imagine. I know secrets you don't even suspect." The daughter, laughing mockingly, approached and asked, "Secrets? What are you talking about? You're just a maid." The young woman smiled almost imperceptibly, but it was a smile that disarmed the air of superiority. "Maid? Maybe, but not naive. I know who really supports this house. I know who really rules here. And I know above all that the truth cannot be hidden behind expensive dresses and crystal glasses." An awkward silence fell. The millionaire, who had been watching silently until then, frowned. For the first time, he seemed not just curious, but uneasy. The young woman had revealed more than she seemed certain of, but her tone indicated that wasn't all. Her gaze met his, and in that instant it became clear that her words weren't just a momentary boldness. They were a promise of something greater yet to come. The room, once dominated by laughter and ostentation, was now suspended in the tension of a revelation whose depths were unknown, and for the first time that night, the humiliation was no longer upon her. That same night, after the guests began to disperse and the music faded, the millionaire remained restless. The young woman's words echoed like an open wound. "I always knew what would happen here today. I know secrets." These weren't random words. They were too sharp for someone who should simply serve. He walked the halls of the mansion in silence, but with every step, he remembered her gaze, firm, challenging, as if he were standing before someone who held the key to something he himself had lost. It was in the office, out of sight, that he discreetly requested a dossier on that employee's life. His power and resources meant nothing could remain hidden for long. When he received the folder, he opened it with a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. And the shock came like a punch to the gut. Her last name. It was a name he knew, a name that should never have appeared there, among cold reports and documents. It was the name of the family that had once been ruined by his decision, a dirty deal, a cut necessary to expand his empire. Suddenly everything made sense. The poverty, the hardness in his eyes, the quiet strength. She was the daughter of the man who had once lost everything because of him. Years before, the tycoon had bought a bankrupt company, leaving hundreds without a livelihood. But one case in particular stuck in his mind. A junior partner who had begged for mercy, promising that without the sale, his family would go under. He hadn't listened. He calculated, he pressed forward, he prevailed. And that man died shortly thereafter, leaving his wife and children in poverty. Now faced with the documents, he discovered that the surviving daughter was precisely the young woman who served in his household. His heart raced. The revelation was unbearable. It wasn't just a coincidence, but a fateful encounter. Her public humiliation had been merely the surface of a much deeper drama. And the look she'd given him that night wasn't one of submission, but of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. The millionaire felt the weight of his past press against his present. The power he had always believed to be his armor now seemed like a burden. He realized he was facing something no amount of money could erase, the ghost of his own cruelty returning in the form of a woman who, in her silence, held all the answers. The day after the party, the mansion seemed empty, even with all the servants milling about and the millionaire's business proceeding as usual. But something was different. She was no longer there. The young maid's absence fell over the house like an uncomfortable silence. There was no goodbye, no explanation. She simply vanished, leaving only the emptiness of her presence. The millionaire noticed this immediately, though he wouldn't admit it to anyone. He feigned indifference, as he always did, but every time he crossed the main hall, he remembered the firm look she had given him. In the early days, she tried to convince herself she was just another employee, easily replaceable. However, she discovered that was not the case. Other employees came and went, but none of them carried that strange blend of strength and mystery that she possessed. Her silence had become more disturbing than any spoken word. The mansion, once a place of power and ostentation, now seemed to echo her absence, as if every corner screamed the name he dared not speak. Business continued, meetings were scheduled, contracts signed, but even then, her memory surfaced. Unexpected. Her steady gaze pierced his thoughts amidst the negotiations. The phrase uttered in the ballroom, "I know secrets," resonated like an invisible accusation. For the first time in years, the millionaire began to lose sleep. He paced his library, rereading old documents, staring at portraits and contracts that until then had been mere tokens of his victory. Now, each piece of paper seemed to weigh heavily, like proof of an ancient guilt. He began searching for her. Discreetly he sent people to track her whereabouts. He discovered only traces, an empty room in a cheap boarding house, an undelivered letter in the mail, testimonies from neighbors who described her as resolute but silent. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving him alone with the weight of his own past. And this emptiness began to bother him more than any adversary ever had. With each passing day, he realized it wasn't just her absence that tormented him, but what she represented. She was the living mirror of everything he had destroyed, the human face of the pain his ambition had caused. And now gone, she had become a ghost that walked with him silently, reminding him that his fortune had cost lives, tears, and stolen childhoods. Deep down, the millionaire was beginning to understand. He didn't miss a maid. He missed someone who, even unintentionally, had cracked his armor and made him face his own humanity. The downfall didn't begin with a massive scandal, but with small, almost imperceptible cracks. First came the rumors. Newspapers began to dig up old deals, forgotten contracts, ruthless decisions that had been hushed up by well-paid lawyers and strategic alliances. Suddenly, reporters were crowding his company's doors. Journalists were asking in interviews about certain names erased from history, and he, accustomed to controlling narratives, felt his authority slipping from his grasp. The truth he had always believed he could bury beneath figures, and powerful allies now began to emerge like a corpse floating in still waters. Society, which had previously applauded him as a symbol of success, began to view him with suspicion. Invitations to events dried up. Old associates began to avoid him. The empire he had built with an iron fist seemed more fragile than ever, and for the first time he experienced the bitter taste of public rejection. The daughter, once arrogant and unbeatable, also felt the repercussions. Her circle of friends dissipated, and the same people who had laughed alongside her on the night of her humiliation now distanced themselves, fearing being associated with the scandal. The family name, engraved on gold plaques and in gossip columns, was now synonymous with contempt. The downfall was not just financial, it was social, moral, and symbolic. The justice the courts had not dared touch seemed to be being carried out by public opinion itself, and at the center of it all was her memory. The young woman who had disappeared carried, without needing to speak a word, the power of truth. It was as if her silence spoke more eloquently than any accusation. Every headline that brought the millionaire's past to light echoed as if written by her hand, though she was nowhere to be seen. The world now did what she had quietly promised: expose the truth behind the luxury and arrogance. The millionaire, once impenetrable, found himself alone in his own home. The mansion's corridors, once filled with fawning. Voices were now plunged into silence and shadow. He who had always dictated rules and silenced his adversaries was beginning to experience the loneliness that comes when the mask of power falls before everyone. There were no parties, no applause, no allies. Only the burning memory of a woman who, even in her absence, had become the center of his downfall. The public downfall wasn't just financial. It was the fall of a myth. The mansion that had once been the scene of glittering parties now felt like a mausoleum. The hallways echoed with his own footsteps, and the silence weighed more heavily than any public accusation. Sitting in his library, surrounded by books he'd never read and trophies from victories that no longer meant anything to him, the millionaire stared into the void. For the first time there were no contracts to sign, no meetings to distract him. There was only his conscience, a silent but implacable enemy. The headlines destroyed him, but they weren't what hurt the most. What ate at him was her memory, her steady gaze, her sharp words, the revelation of who she truly was. He began to revisit the past, the decisions he'd made without looking back. He remembered the partner who'd begged for mercy, the family who'd lost everything, the children left homeless. He'd never paid them any attention. To him, they were just numbers in reports, natural consequences of those who wanted to succeed. But now, each forgotten face came alive in his mind, as if each tear were coming to collect its debt. Nights became unbearable. Sleep eluded him, replaced by memories of conversations he'd never had with his own daughter, of gestures of affection he'd exchanged for expensive gifts, of loves he'd let slip away in the name of unbridled ambition. He realized he'd built nothing solid, only golden walls around himself, and those walls were now crumbling, leaving him naked before the truth. It was in this state of solitude that he began to change. He stopped frequenting powerful circles, stayed away from parties and declined invitations. Instead, he began walking the streets without security, observing ordinary people he'd never noticed before. He saw mothers carrying heavy bags, exhausted subway workers, children selling candy at traffic lights. For the first time he felt ashamed not of being exposed, but of never having truly seen anyone. The transformation didn't come with a heroic gesture, but with a slow erosion of arrogance. He, who had always believed himself unbeatable, now found himself dwarfed by the simplicity of life. The millionaire began to realize that true power lay not in humiliation or accumulation, but in recognizing the value of what he had always ignored: dignity. Deep down he knew this transformation wasn't just because of the society that judged him, it was because of her. For the young woman who had disappeared and left in him a void no amount of money could fill. He no longer wanted to find her, confront her, or demand anything. He simply wanted a chance to say something he'd never said to anyone. "Forgive me." The meeting didn't take place at a lavish party, nor in a marble hall. It took place on a cold, ordinary street, where the wind carried loose papers and the brightness of the shop windows contrasted with the rush of people who didn't have time to look around. He saw her first. She was different. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wasn't carrying trays. Her eyes didn't have the shadow of humiliation, but rather an even clearer firmness, as if she had freed herself from all constraints. She walked with sure steps, dressed simply, but with the dignity of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The millionaire stopped, unable to move for a few seconds. His heart, which for weeks had felt heavy in his chest, raced almost painfully. He crossed the street without thinking, and when she noticed him, there was an invisible silence between them, as if the entire city had lowered its volume to watch the encounter. He tried to speak, but the words didn't come as easily as before. The man who had always known how to command meetings and silence opponents now felt small before this woman. "I looked for you," he murmured, almost hesitantly. She just looked at him, unhurried to respond, as if she'd been waiting for that moment to weigh the weight of what he had become. Her gaze was calm, but hard. There was no hatred, nor immediate forgiveness. There was judgment. There was memory. There was the memory of every night she and her family suffered for decisions he made without remorse. He tried to move closer, but she took a step back, imposing a distance that spoke louder than any words. "I know who you are," he said finally, his voice breaking. "And I know what I did." It was the first time he had acknowledged the weight of the past aloud. She didn't respond. She just held his gaze, as if listening but not rushing to offer absolution. The cold wind passed between them, carrying the metallic smell of the city, and for a moment it seemed the whole world was waiting for her answer. Their reunion wasn't marked by tears or hugs. It was marked by silence, a silence that carried centuries of pain, arrogance, and now regret. He looked at her as he'd never looked at anyone, not as a servant, not as an obstacle, not as someone beneath him. He looked at her as an equal, and in that moment he understood that the true judgment wouldn't come from society, but from her eyes. The wind blew hard on the corner where the two met again, lifting hair, papers, and memories that weighed more heavily than any storm. The millionaire stood before her, vulnerable as never before, his shoulders slumped, his eyes watering, and his voice cracking between regret and fear. He tried to approach, but she neither retreated nor advanced. She simply stood there, erect, like a statue of silence. Passers-by passed by, without noticing that in that moment, something greater than a reunion was being decided. It was the final judgment of a past that could no longer be erased. She watched him for long seconds, which felt like hours. She saw in that face the features of the man who had destroyed her childhood, but also the shadow of someone who was now broken, stripped of the pride that sustained him. He didn't need to say anything else. His eyes begged for forgiveness, even before the words were out. Still, she didn't give an immediate answer. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then spoke, calmly but firmly. "I didn't come here to be your punishment. Life has already taken care of that." He shivered. There was no hatred in her voice, but there was no sweetness either. There was a cutting clarity, like a sharp blade separating past and present. She continued, "You took everything from me. You took the home I grew up in. You took my mother's hope. You took my father's dignity. I watched my family fall apart because of your ambition, and for years I dreamed of seeing you fallen, humiliated, destroyed. But now that I see you like this, I understand that I'm not the one who needs to carry this weight. You already do, and it's greater than any revenge I could ever hope for." The millionaire tried to justify himself, but she held up her hand, interrupting. "No, I don't want a belated apology. I don't want promises. I just want to move on with my life." The words fell on him like hammers, firm, final. She didn't offer forgiveness, but she didn't offer hatred either. She offered only freedom, hers and his, condemning him to live with his own conscience. She took a step back, then another. He called her name, but his voice was choked, desperate, like that of a man crying out not for love but for redemption. She looked at him one last time, her expression a mix of pain and strength, and said simply, "You taught me that silence is also an answer, and this is mine." Then she turned, leaving him alone on the sidewalk, surrounded by the distant noise of the city that continued indifferently as always. The city continued its relentless pace, lights blaring in skyscrapers that touched the clouds, horns echoing like a chaotic symphony, and people crossing streets without ever looking at each other. However, that night, the millionaire walked alone, without security, without haste, only with the weight of silence. He passed the same corner where she had left him and stopped. The cold wind blew, lifting dry leaves that swirled around his feet, like memories that never fade. He looked up and saw his own reflection in a shop window, an aged, scarred man, stripped of the radiance that once defined his existence. For the first time, he did not take his eyes off himself. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, she walked down a quiet street, lit only by ancient streetlights. She carried a simple shopping bag, but her expression was light, almost serene. She stopped before a lit window, where children laughed around a modest table, and a small smile spread across her face. It was as if she had finally found a place to belong, not for wealth, but for peace. In the empty mansion, the crystal chandelier still shone, but there was no one left to admire it. The room that had once been a stage of humiliation and power was now nothing more than a hollow space, illuminated by a cold, unwarming light. The millionaire entered and walked to the center of the carpet, where he knelt alone, his hands touching the same floor where she had collected the shards. He closed his eyes, letting a tear fall, not as a public gesture, but as a silent confession. And so, without speeches, without declared forgiveness, poetic justice was complete. She moved on, carrying the dignity no one could steal. He remained, a prisoner of his own conscience, discovering too late that true power never lay in gold, but in the silence of those who endured his cruelty. The world spun indifferently, but that night, on two different streets in the same city, two destinies crossed for the last time, not in words, but in images forever etched in the memory of life. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below. I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.